Muscle cars are supposed to be all about raw power, thunderous engines, and blistering straight-line speed. But not every car that wore the muscle badge actually lived up to the hype. Hidden beneath aggressive styling, bold stripes, and intimidating names, some models secretly packed engines that were far weaker than their looks suggested. Whether it was due to emissions regulations, insurance restrictions, or just poor engineering decisions, these cars became wolves in sheep's clothing. Or maybe sheep in wolf's clothing. Today, we're counting down 13 muscle cars that secretly had weak engines, and some of these names may surprise you. Number 13. 1974 Ford Mustang II. When people think of muscle cars, the Ford Mustang is usually near the top of the list. But in the mid-1970s, the iconic pony car fell victim to one of the darkest eras for American performance: the oil crisis and strict new emissions regulations. Out of that environment came the 1974 Ford Mustang II, a car that looked sporty but was secretly one of the weakest muscle cars ever to wear the Mustang badge. The Mustang II was radically downsized compared to its predecessors, built on the Ford Pinto platform to prioritize fuel economy over performance. That alone was a shock for enthusiasts, but the engine options made things worse. The base model came with a pathetic 2.3-liter inline-4, producing just 88 horsepower. Let that sink in. Less than 90 horses in a car that was supposed to represent America's performance icon. Even the upgraded 2.8-liter V6 only offered 105 horsepower, which was barely enough to get the car out of its own way. Ford did eventually offer a 302 cubic inch 5.0-liter V8, but by then it was strangled by emissions controls and produced a measly 140 horsepower, a far cry from the fire-breathing small blocks of the late 1960s. For perspective, the 1969 Mustang Mach-1's 428 Cobra Jet was making 335 horsepower, more than double what the Mustang II could muster. Visually, the Mustang II wasn't terrible. It had sharp lines and sporty proportions, and it sold well initially thanks to the fuel crisis. But for muscle car enthusiasts expecting speed, it was a crushing disappointment. The car had the looks, the badges, and the heritage, but when you hit the gas pedal, it felt more like an economy car than a performance machine. Over the years, the Mustang II has earned a reputation as one of the low points in Mustang history. Collectors often overlook it, and enthusiasts sometimes pretend it never existed. Still, it serves as a reminder of just how tough the 1970s were for muscle cars in general. For drivers over 40 who grew up during that era, the Mustang Tucano might bring back memories, not of roaring engines and drag strip glory, but of compromises and disappointment. It's a car that proves sometimes even legends stumble. And in 1974, the Mustang stumbled hard. Number 12. 1982. Chevrolet Camaro Iron Duke. The Chevrolet Camaro has always been locked in battle with the Mustang, and like its rival, it too suffered through the early 1980s, an era when performance took a back seat to fuel efficiency and emissions compliance. The lowest point of all? The 1982 Camaro, equipped with the infamous Iron Duke engine. On the outside, the third-generation Camaro looked promising. It had sleeker lines, a more aerodynamic profile, and modern styling that hinted at speed. It looked every bit the part of a muscle car. But pop the hood of the base model, and you'd find not a V8, not even a decent V6, but a 2.5-liter inline-4 Iron Duke engine. And its output? A pitiful 90 horsepower. That's right, 90 horses powering a car that was supposed to compete with Mustangs and carry on the Camaro's muscle car reputation. Acceleration was embarrassing, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times creeping past 20 seconds. Some economy cars from the same era were quicker. To make matters worse, the Camaro Iron Duke wasn't even fuel efficient enough to justify the loss of performance, leaving it in an awkward middle ground where it failed both as a muscle car and as a practical commuter. Chevy did offer stronger engines in the lineup, including a 2.8-liter V6 and a 5.0-liter V8, but those weren't much better in their early forms. The top high-output V8 in 1982 made just 165 horsepower, a laughable figure compared to the 375 horsepower big blocks from just a decade earlier. But the Iron Duke-equipped base model was the true embarrassment. It turned what should have been a performance icon into a sluggish poser. Culturally, the Iron Duke Camaro was the car you bought if you wanted the Camaro's looks, but couldn't afford, or didn't care about, performance. Unfortunately, many ended up on the roads, giving the Camaro a reputation problem in the early 80s. For enthusiasts, it felt like Chevrolet had betrayed the car's muscle roots by putting such a weak engine in it at all. For drivers over 40, the memory of the Iron Duke Camaro is probably still fresh. It was the car that looked like a muscle car, but drove like an underpowered sedan. Today, collectors largely ignore these models, and restorers often rip out the four-cylinder in favor of a proper V8. The 1982 Camaro Iron Duke is living proof that appearances can be deceiving. Underneath its sporty new body, it was one of the weakest muscle cars to ever wear the badge, and a cautionary tale of what happens when style trumps substance. Number 11. 1978, Dodge Challenger, second generation. The Dodge Challenger is often remembered for its glory days in the early 1970s, when it squared off against the Mustang, Camaro, and Cuda with fire-breathing V8s. But by the time the second generation debuted in 1978, the Challenger had become a shadow of its former self, so much so that it barely qualified as a muscle car anymore. Why? Because the second-gen Challenger wasn't even a true Mopar muscle machine. Instead of being based on the E-body platform like the original, it was essentially a rebadged Mitsubishi Galant Lambda imported from Japan. That meant smaller proportions, less muscle car DNA, and worst of all, underwhelming engines. The base power plant was a 1.6-liter inline-4, making a pathetic 77 horsepower. Even the upgraded 2.6-liter four-cylinder only produced 105 horsepower, which wouldn't be out of place in a compact economy car of the time. For comparison, the 1970 Challenger RT with a 426 HEM made 425 horsepower, literally 4 times the output. Even the largest available engine, a 2.6-liter Hemi four-cylinder, in name only, was hopelessly weak by muscle car standards. Performance was as disappointing as you'd expect. 0 to 60 miles per hour took well over 13 seconds, and top speeds barely broke 100 miles per hour. To add insult to injury, the styling was bland and lacked the aggressive presence of the original Challenger. It looked more like a generic coupe than a muscle car. For enthusiasts who remembered the roaring big block Mopars of just a few years earlier, The 1978 Challenger was a bitter pill to swallow. Sales were modest, but the car was a critical failure. Muscle car purists dismissed it entirely, and even today, it's one of the least collectible Challengers ever made. It didn't help that the Camaro and Mustang were also struggling in the late 70s, making the entire segment feel like it had lost its soul. For drivers over 40, the second-gen Challenger may be remembered as the dark years of Mopar performance. It was a time when emissions regulations, oil crises, and changing consumer tastes gutted once great muscle machines. The 1978 Dodge Challenger stands as one of the weakest muscle cars in history. Not because of poor build quality or styling alone, but because it betrayed the very idea of what the Challenger name once represented. It was muscle in name only, with an engine lineup that was anything but muscular. Number 10. 1977 Pontiac Firebird Esprit with the 301 V8. The Pontiac Firebird is an icon of the muscle car era, especially thanks to its starring role in Smokey and the Bandit. By the late 1970s, however, not every Firebird was built for high-octane chases across the South. Some versions carried engines so weak they embarrassed the legendary nameplate. Case in point, the 1977 Pontiac Firebird Esprit with the 301 cubic inch V8. On the outside, the Firebird Esprit looked every bit the part of a muscle car. It had the long hood, the aggressive stance, and could even be optioned with flashy decals that screamed performance. But under the hood, the base 301 V8 was a huge letdown. Thanks to emissions regulations and restrictive tuning, it produced a measly 135 horsepower. That's less than some family sedans of the same era. For comparison, the legendary Firebird Trans Am 455 from just a few years earlier had made well over 300 horsepower. By 1977, buyers expecting the same kind of muscle were in for a rude awakening. Even stepping up to the optional 305 or 350 small blocks barely improved performance, as they too were choked down by emissions equipment. Performance testing at the time confirmed the Firebird Esprit's lack of muscle. 0 to 60 miles per hour times hovered around 12 to 13 seconds, and quarter-mile runs were lethargic by any standard, especially for a car wearing the Firebird badge. Drivers were treated to plenty of noise, but very little actual thrust. Culturally, the timing made things even worse. Smokey and the Bandit had just made the Firebird Trans Am a superstar, with audiences expecting every Firebird to have the same kind of fire-breathing performance. But the Esprit with the 301 was the opposite. All show, no go. It looked the part of a highway hero, but drove more like a cruiser. For drivers over 40, the 1977 Firebird Esprit represents the frustration of the era. It was proof that by the late 1970s, the muscle car nameplates still existed, but the engines beneath them often didn't live up to the promise. The 1977 Pontiac Firebird Esprit with the 301 V8 stands as a cautionary tale. Just because it looks like a muscle car doesn't mean it has the muscle. Number 9. 1976 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu. The Chevrolet Chevelle is often remembered as one of the greatest muscle cars of all time. Models like the 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6 remain legends, delivering earth-shaking horsepower and quarter-mile dominance. But by the mid-1970s, the Chevelle name had been dragged into the performance doldrums. The 1976 Chevelle Malibu is a prime example. a car that looked muscular but hid engines that were anything but. The base Malibu came standard, with a 250 cubic inch inline six, making just 105 horsepower. Yes, a six-cylinder in a Chevelle, and one that barely had enough grunt to move the car's nearly 4,000-pound body with confidence. Buyers could option up to a small block V8, but even those were pitiful by muscle car standards. The available 305 cubic inch V8 put out around 140 horsepower, while the larger 350 cubic inch V8 managed only 145 to 165 horsepower, depending on the tune. For a nameplate that once offered 450 horsepower in its heyday, these numbers were devastating. By 1976, Chevrolet had gutted the Chevelle's performance identity in the name of fuel economy and emissions compliance. As a result, the car had the looks: long hood, aggressive stance, sporty trim, but not the muscle to back it up. Performance figures reflected the disappointment. 0 to 60 miles per hour times often stretched into the 13 to 15-second range, making the Malibu slower than some compact imports of the time. Quarter-mile times were equally embarrassing, turning what had been a drag strip hero into a rolling cruiser with no bite. The styling didn't help its reputation either. The '76 Malibu carried the heavy, boxy lines that were common in the mid-1970s, giving it the appearance of size and power. But underneath it all, the engine bay told the sad truth. For drivers over 40, the 1976 Malibu may be remembered as the ultimate betrayal of the Chevelle's muscle car roots. It was a car that cashed in on the name but delivered little in the way of performance. Today, collectors largely skip over these mid-70s models, focusing instead on the golden-era Chevelles from the late 60s and early 70s. The '76 Malibu is often overlooked or used as a base for resto mods, where enthusiasts rip out the weak engines and replace them with something worthy of the Chevelle legacy. The 1976 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu is proof that not every car wearing a legendary badge deserves the glory. It may have looked the part, but under the hood, it was a muscle car in name only. Number 8. 1975. Dodge Charger SE. The Dodge Charger is a legend in the muscle car world, immortalized by its appearances in NASCAR, TV shows like The Dukes of Hazzard, and its reputation for raw Mopar power. But by 1975, the Charger had lost much of its muscle. The Charger SE of that year was more about personal luxury than quarter-mile dominance, and under the hood, it was a disappointment. The base engine for the 1975 Charger SE was a 225 cubic inch slant six, producing just 100 horsepower. Yes, you read that right. A six-cylinder in a car that once packed the mighty 426 HEMI. Buyers could step up to small block V8s like the 318, 150 horsepower, or 360, 180 horsepower. But even those were strangled by emissions controls and couldn't deliver the kind of thrills muscle car fans expected. Even the big block 400 and 440 V8 engines were shadows of their former selves, making under 220 horsepower in most configurations. To put it in perspective, a 1970 Charger RT 446 pack produced 390 horsepower, while the 426 HEMI made 425. By 1975, Dodge was selling a car with barely half that output at best, and a measly 100 horsepower at worst. Performance figures told the sad truth. 0 to 60 miles per hour, times ranged from 11 to 14 seconds, depending on the engine. That made the Charger SE more of a boulevard cruiser than a muscle car. It was heavy, underpowered, and geared more for comfort than speed. Dodge marketed it as a personal luxury coupe, signaling that the muscle car era was on life support. Visually, the Charger SE still had presence. Its long hood, hidden headlights, and wide stance gave it the appearance of a performance car. But the styling was deceptive. Underneath, the engines couldn't deliver the thrills promised by its aggressive looks. For drivers over 40, the 1975 Charger SE is a reminder of how quickly things changed in the mid-70s. In just a few years, a muscle icon was transformed into a watered-down cruiser, with weak engines that embarrassed the Charger name. Today, collectors largely overlook the 75 Charger SE, preferring the fire-breathing models from 1968 to 1971. The 75 is often seen as part of the Malaise era, where great names survived on styling alone while their engines were neutered. The 1975 Dodge Charger SE is proof that even legends can lose their way. It looked like a muscle car, but with engines that barely cleared 100 horsepower, it was secretly one of the weakest Chargers ever built. Number 7. 1979 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. By the late 1970s, the Chevrolet Monte Carlo had become one of GM's most stylish personal luxury coupes. Sleek rooflines, sporty trim packages, and long hoods gave it the look of a muscle machine. But under the surface, the 1979 Monte Carlo was anything but powerful. In fact, it was one of the weakest muscle cars of its era. The base model came with a 200 cubic inch V6, producing just 94 horsepower. Yes, fewer than 100 horses in a car that weighed over 3,300 pounds. That meant sluggish acceleration and a driving experience that was the polar opposite of the fire-breathing Chevys from less than a decade earlier. Even if you opted for a V8, things didn't get much better. The available 267 cubic inch V8 made 125 horsepower, while the upgraded 305 V8 produced 140. The top option, a 350 cubic inch small block V8, managed a weak 170 horsepower at best. Compare that to the Chevelle SS 454 of 1970, which made 450 horsepower, and the decline is staggering. Performance figures reflected the drop. A 1979 Monte Carlo with the base engine needed more than 15 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, and even the V8 models struggled to break the 12-second mark. Quarter-mile times were equally unimpressive, leaving the Monte Carlo a far cry from the drag strip dominators of the 1960s. What makes the 79 Monte Carlo even more frustrating is how deceptive it was. With sporty styling, vinyl roofs, rally wheels, and optional stripes, it looked like it should be fast. Buyers expecting performance got a car that cruised comfortably down highways, but offered almost no excitement when you hit the gas. For many drivers over 40, the 1979 Monte Carlo represents the Malaise era perfectly. A car with all the looks and none of the muscle. It was marketed more as a personal luxury coupe than a performance car. But because it shared design cues with real muscle cars, it lured in enthusiasts who wanted speed, and left them disappointed. Today, these Monte Carlos are remembered more for their looks than their performance. Collectors often restomod them, ripping out the weak engines and dropping in high-powered small blocks or LS swaps to give them the bite they always should have had. The 1979 Chevrolet Monte Carlo is living proof that a car can look muscular and still be weak at its core. It's a stylish cruiser, yes, but as a muscle car, it was secretly one of the weakest of them all. Number 6. 1971 Plymouth Duster 340, after the detune. The Plymouth Duster started out as a clever blend of affordability and performance. Early versions, especially the Duster 340, were surprisingly quick for their price, earning respect as a budget muscle car. But by 1971, emissions rules and insurance pressures began to choke the life out of Plymouth's compact powerhouse. The result? A car that looked aggressive, but secretly packed far less muscle than it promised. Originally, the 340 cubic inch small block V8 in the Duster was rated at 275 horsepower in 1970, a healthy figure for a lightweight, compact coupe. But by 1971, thanks to stricter emissions controls, lowered compression ratios, and new SAE net horsepower ratings, the same engine was advertised at just 240 horsepower. On paper, it didn't sound too bad, but in practice, the car felt softer, slower, and less eager than its predecessor. Worse still, Plymouth offered the Duster with even weaker engines. Buyers who didn't opt for the 340 could end up with a slant 6 producing as little as 105 horsepower. A joke in a car that carried the muscle car image with bold graphics, scoops, and spoilers. The mismatch between styling and performance meant some Dusters were more bark than bite. Performance numbers backed this up. Early Duster 347s could run the quarter mile in the low 14-second range, but by 1971, times had slipped noticeably. The weaker versions with 6-cylinder engines often struggled to break the 20-second mark in the quarter mile. Hardly muscle car material. The styling, of course, was still muscular. The Duster carried bold stripes, aggressive hoods, and sporty interiors that made it look ready to take on Camaros and Mustangs. But unless you ticked the right option boxes, you were likely driving a sheep in wolf's clothing. For drivers over 40, the 1971 Duster represents the beginning of the end for true budget muscle. It showed how quickly performance was being drained from once great cars, even if the marketing and styling continued to promise thrills. Today, collectors value the early, high-compression Duster 340s, while the later models from 71 onward are often overlooked. They look the part, but without serious engine swaps or modifications, they lack the muscle that made the name famous. The 1971 Plymouth Duster 340, and its weaker siblings, is a prime example of a muscle car that secretly lost its punch. It's a cautionary tale of how regulation and compromise transformed muscle icons into mere pretenders. Number 5. 1973 Mercury Cougar XR7. When the Mercury Cougar first launched in 1967, it was billed as a slightly more upscale cousin to the Mustang, combining sporty performance with luxury touches. By the early 1970s, however, the Cougar had drifted far from its muscle car roots. The 1973 Cougar XR7 looked muscular with its long hood, hidden headlights, and bold trim, but under the hood, many versions were shockingly weak. By 1973, tightening emissions rules and rising insurance rates were choking performance across the board. The Cougar's once mighty engine lineup had been watered down significantly. The base XR7 came with a 351 cubic inch Windsor Vive 8, but instead of the strong output of earlier years, it produced only 168 horsepower. Even the larger optional 400 and 429 cubic inch engines, once considered beasts, were reduced to 170 to 225 horsepower, depending on the tune. The days of tire-shredding muscle were clearly over. To make matters worse, the Cougar had grown heavier. With added safety equipment, luxury features, and bulkier styling, it tipped the scales at nearly 4,000 pounds. That meant the weak horsepower had to drag around a heavy body, making acceleration sluggish. 0 to 60 miles per hour times ballooned to over 10 seconds, while quarter-mile runs were well into the 17 to 18-second range. For a car that carried the muscle car image, those numbers were embarrassing. The styling, however, told a different story. The 1973 Cougar XR7 still looked like a performance machine. It had sporty lines, aggressive grille work, and available stripes and wheels that screamed muscle. Buyers who remembered the earlier high-compression Cougars of the late 60s expected excitement. Instead, they got a luxury-oriented cruiser with engines that had been neutered by regulations. For drivers over 40, the 1973 Cougar XR7 may stand out as the moment the Cougar stopped being a muscle car and became more of a personal luxury coupe. It shifted its focus toward comfort, features, and style, traits that appealed to older buyers but alienated enthusiasts who wanted raw performance. Today, the 73 Cougar XR7 is remembered more for its looks and comfort than its speed. Collectors rarely seek them out for performance, though some see them as perfect candidates for engine swaps and resto mods. The 1973 Mercury Cougar XR7 proves that even cars with strong styling and muscle car marketing could secretly be weak under the hood. It's a car that looked fast parked at the curb but failed to deliver when you stomped on the gas. Number 4. 1977 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. By the mid to late 1970s, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme had become one of the best-selling cars in America. It had sleek styling, a reputation for comfort, and plenty of sporty trim packages that made it look like a muscle car. But when it came to engines, the 1977 Cutlass Supreme was one of the biggest letdowns of the era. At its core, the Cutlass was no longer built to dominate stoplights. It was built to appeal to mainstream buyers. The base engine was a 231 cubic inch V6, producing just 110 horsepower. That's right. One of the most popular muscle-looking cars of the late 70s came standard with a weak V6 that barely managed to keep up with traffic. If you wanted more power, you could option up to small block V8s like the 260, 110 horsepower, or 305, 145 horsepower. Even the larger 350 cubic inch Rocket 5.8 struggled at 170 horsepower, thanks to emissions strangling. The top dog? A 403 V8 that managed only 185 horsepower, a number that would have been considered laughable just a few years earlier. Performance was predictably dull. 0 to 60 miles per hour times averaged 12 to 15 seconds, depending on the engine, and quarter-mile runs hovered in the 18 to 19-second range. For a car that often wore sporty trim like the 442 nameplate, those numbers were downright embarrassing. The once feared Oldsmobile 442 synonymous with big power in the 1960s, had been reduced to nothing more than a stripe and sticker package. Styling was the Cutlass Supreme's saving grace. With its long hood, sharp lines, and optional rally wheels, it looked like a muscle car. Buyers could feel like they were getting something sporty, even if the performance didn't back it up. This deception helped make the Cutlass a bestseller, but it also cemented its reputation among enthusiasts as a poser. For drivers over 40, the 1977 Cutlass Supreme represents the split between looks and performance. Many people grew up seeing these cars everywhere, but few remember them being fast. Instead, they were comfortable daily drivers dressed up to look tougher than they actually were. Today, the 77 Cutlass Supreme is remembered more for being a cultural icon of the 70s than a true muscle car. Collectors often resto-mod them with modern LS engines to give them the muscle they always deserved. The 1977 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme proves that popularity doesn't equal performance. It may have looked muscular, but under the hood, it was secretly one of the weakest cars ever to wear sporty stripes. Number 3. 1974 Pontiac GTO. The Pontiac GTO is often hailed as the car that started the muscle car movement in the 1960s. By the time the 1974 model year rolled around, however, the GTO was a ghost of its former self. The once mighty legend had been stripped of its performance edge, reduced to a shell that looked the part but lacked the muscle under the hood. By 1974, Pontiac had downsized the GTO and placed it on the compact Pontiac Ventura platform, moving away from the mid-size body that made earlier models iconic. Under the hood, the only engine available was a 350 cubic inch V8, producing just 200 horsepower. That's right, gone were the days of 389 tri-powers and 400 cubic inch Ram air monsters. Instead, buyers were left with an underwhelming V8 that struggled to move the car with authority. Performance numbers reflected the decline. 0 to 60 miles per hour took about 9 seconds, and the quarter mile was in the high 16-second range. While that might sound passable for a 1970s car, for a GTO, a name once synonymous with tire-shredding acceleration, it was downright disappointing. The styling also didn't help. While the Ventura-based GTO had some sporty cues like hood scoops, decals, and GTO badging, it lacked the muscular stance of earlier models. To many enthusiasts, it felt like Pontiac had slapped the GTO badge on a compact car to cash in on the name rather than deliver true performance. The oil crisis, emissions standards, and insurance crackdowns had gutted the entire muscle car segment. But the 1974 GTO stood out because of the legacy it carried. Fans who remembered the ferocious 64-70 GTOs were crushed to see the name attached to a car that barely qualified as sporty, let alone muscular. For drivers over 40, the 74 GTO may represent one of the most painful reminders of the malaise era. It showed how quickly icons could fall when the industry shifted its priorities. Today, the 74 GTO is rarely sought after by collectors, overshadowed by its glorious ancestors. Most enthusiasts prefer to forget it, seeing it as the low point of a once proud muscle car dynasty. The 1974 Pontiac GTO is proof that even legends can lose their way. It was a car with a legendary badge, but an engine bay that couldn't back it up, making it one of the weakest muscle cars to ever wear the GTO name. Number 2. 1978 AMC Gremlin GT. When most people think of the American Motors Corporation, AMC, they remember quirky cars that stood out from the big three. The AMC Gremlin is one of the most infamous. Its chopped-back styling made it instantly recognizable. But in 1978, AMC decided to slap some stripes, decals, and sporty trim on it, calling it the Gremlin GT. What looked like a muscle car package on the outside was secretly one of the weakest pretenders ever built. The Gremlin GT came with a 304 cubic inch V8, which on paper might sound promising. But in the malaise era, numbers rarely told the whole story. Thanks to low compression ratios and emissions strangling, that 304 V8 produced a pathetic 120 horsepower. Even AMC's six-cylinder options made nearly as much power. For comparison, AMC's own AMX and Javelin muscle cars earlier in the decade made well over 300 horsepower, leaving the Gremlin GT an embarrassing step backward. Performance was laughable for something that wore GT badging. 0 to 60 miles per hour times hovered around 12 to 13 seconds, with quarter-mile runs in the high 18-second range. By the late 1970s, foreign compact cars like the Volkswagen Golf or Datsun 280Z could run circles around it, leaving the Gremlin GT not just weak, but outdated. The styling, however, told a different story. With racing stripes, a sport steering wheel, and GT badges, AMC tried to sell the illusion of performance. Buyers who didn't look at the spec sheet could be fooled into thinking they were getting a legitimate muscle machine. But once you got behind the wheel, reality hit hard. The GT was slow, heavy, and uninspiring. For drivers over 40, the Gremlin GT may stand out as one of the strangest attempts to cash in on muscle car style without delivering the goods. AMC didn't have the resources of GM or Ford, so they leaned heavily on marketing tricks instead of genuine engineering. Unfortunately, enthusiasts saw right through it. Today, the Gremlin GT is remembered more as a curiosity than a collectible. While AMC fans may enjoy its quirks, no one mistakes it for a true performance car. Most have been forgotten, with the few survivors either restored as oddities or modified with engines that finally give them some real power. The 1978 AMC Gremlin GT proves that even the oddballs of the muscle car era weren't immune to weak engines. It's a car that looked ready for a drag race, but barely had the power to keep up with traffic, earning its spot high on this list of disappointments. Number 1. 1971. Ford Maverick Grabber. The early 1970s were a strange time for muscle cars. Insurance companies were hiking rates, emissions standards were looming, and automakers were scrambling to find ways to sell performance without actually delivering it. Few cars embody that bait and switch better than the 1971 Ford Maverick Grabber, a car that looked every bit like a muscle machine but had one of the weakest engine lineups imaginable. The Maverick Grabber was Ford's attempt to inject excitement into its compact Maverick. With bold graphics, sporty stripes, a dual-dome hood, and aggressive trim, it looked like a scaled-down Mustang Mach 1. Buyers could easily be convinced that it was a true muscle car bargain. But under the hood, the base Grabber engine was a 170 cubic inch inline six, producing a laughable 82 horsepower. That's right, less power than some modern lawnmowers. Even if you upgraded to the optional 200 cubic inch inline six, you only got 120 horsepower. And while Ford eventually offered V8s in later Mavericks, The early Grabber models never lived up to their muscular looks. The Grabber name suggested tire-smoking performance, but the reality was slow acceleration and lackluster top speeds. Performance numbers confirmed it. With the six-cylinder, 0 to 60 miles per hour often took 15 to 16 seconds, and quarter-mile times pushed past 20 seconds. In an era when true muscle cars were still running 13 to 14-second quarter miles, the Maverick Grabber was completely outclassed. It was more of an economy car in a flashy costume than a real competitor. The tragedy of the Maverick Grabber is how convincing the illusion was. The styling cues, hood scoops, spoilers, decals, made it look like a pocket rocket. Many young buyers were drawn in by the affordable price and sporty looks, only to discover they'd bought one of the weakest muscle cars of the era. For drivers over 40, the Grabber may bring back memories of friends or neighbors who thought they had scored a muscle machine, only to realize their car couldn't keep up with anything more powerful than a station wagon. It's the ultimate example of the gap between style and substance in the malaise years. Today, the Maverick Grabber has found a second life among collectors, mostly for its quirky looks and retro appeal. But no one confuses it with a true muscle car. Its place in history is cemented not as a performance icon, but as a poser that promised much and delivered little. The 1971 Ford Maverick Grabber tops this list because it represents the worst kind of muscle car betrayal. A car that looked fast, sounded fast, and wore the badge proudly, yet secretly had one of the weakest engines ever stuffed under a sporty hood. Muscle cars are remembered for roaring engines and raw power. But, as this list proves, not every model lived up to the legend. From downsized icons to flashy pretenders, these 13 cars looked the part, but secretly hid weak engines that disappointed enthusiasts. They remind us that the muscle car era wasn't always about horsepower. It was also about compromises, regulations, and missed opportunities. Still, even the weakest of them remain fascinating chapters in automotive history.